You stand in the nave of a Gothic cathedral at dusk. The air carries a quality you feel before you hear it. A low resonance arrives not as sound, but as a physical presence distributed through your skeleton. Your chest cavity becomes an amplification chamber. The bones of your skull vibrate in sympathy with the vault above. You are not listening to sound. You are resonating. Most people attribute this to the scale of the building, to the architecture of awe, to something spiritual. That is the explanation that has been offered for 8 centuries. It is not what the physical evidence shows. Why does every major medieval Gothic cathedral produce the same specific acoustic frequency? The exact frequency neuroscientists have now measured as the point at which the human brain's language center measurably shuts down. And why does every document recording what was systematically done to the inside of these buildings in the 1540s survive in perfect detail, while no document has ever been found explaining why they were originally built the way they were? Every major medieval Gothic cathedral sustains a natural acoustic resonance at approximately 110 Hz. This appears consistently across every major cathedral built between 1140 and 1520. The resonance frequency is a function of vault height, stone density, the proportions of the interior space, and the material properties of limestone. The frequency does not vary. In 2008, researchers at UCLA published EEG measurements showing that at exactly 110 Hz, activity in the brain's language center drops measurably, and the prefrontal cortex shifts from left hemisphere dominance to right hemisphere dominance, the hemisphere associated with emotional processing, spatial awareness, and the dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. The chant written to be performed inside these buildings was written in the frequency range of the male voice that most strongly activates that resonance. The vowel sounds of Gregorian chant cluster around the frequencies that trigger maximum acoustic coupling with limestone. The pitch, the duration, the silence between phrases, none of it arbitrary. Beginning in the 1530s, church wardens across England began installing wooden pews into cathedral interiors. Their accounts survive. The cost of timber is recorded. The names of the carpenters are recorded. The dates of installation are recorded. The acoustic profile of the original empty stone interior, which had produced that 110 Hz resonance field, is not mentioned once. The documentation of what was changed is meticulous. The documentation of what was lost says nothing about what was there. Those two facts sit next to each other in the historical record, and the logical connection between them is missing. A resonance field that produced measurable neurological effects. Systematic interior alteration that dismantled the conditions producing it. Nothing connecting them in the written record. That is the conflict at the center of this investigation. These buildings produced documented physiological effects on every person who entered them. The record of their systematic conversion survives. The documentation of why they were designed to produce those effects does not exist. That gap has a shape, and this is what we are walking into. Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis designed the first Gothic cathedral in the 1140s. His writings survive. His letters survive. What he describes experiencing inside his own construction is not what the official account says these buildings were for. The gap between what he describes and what the official history says has been sitting in the archive for 9 centuries. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. The accepted explanation follows 2 centuries of architectural history. Cathedrals built to express religious aspiration. Vaulted heights drawing the eye toward heaven. Stained glass illustrating biblical narrative for a population that could not read. East-west orientation as theological symbolism. Christ as the rising sun. The altar facing east. Pilgrimage as spiritual devotion. The building as a container for worship. This is what has been taught in universities and reproduced in architectural histories across generations. This is the received version. It is coherent. It is internally consistent. But the physical evidence tells a different story. The scope of examination: 43 major Gothic cathedrals across France, England, Germany, and Spain. The evidence fields: acoustics, optical properties, geometric proportion, historical documentation, and the transmission of builder knowledge through guild records. The 110 Hz resonance is the first body of physical evidence. The resonance frequency is a function of vault height, stone density, the proportions of the interior space, and the material properties of the floor. Limestone produces this result consistently across sites built across 3 centuries in 4 countries. The resonance does not vary. It does not depend on construction method or regional tradition. The stone itself delivers the frequency. The UCLA finding is measurable and reproducible. At 110 Hz, the language center of the prefrontal cortex drops significantly in activation. Simultaneously, the right hemisphere increases in activity. The region associated with emotional processing, spatial awareness, the dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. The effect is not dramatic. It is not a hallucination. It is a shift in the balance of how the brain processes information. The person remains conscious, but their mode of awareness has changed. This is neuroscience, not inference, not interpretation, measurable. When chant activates this resonance inside a stone cathedral, the experience is physical. The resonance arrives not as sound, but as sensation distributed through the skeleton. The chest cavity becomes an amplification chamber. The bones of the skull vibrate in sympathy with the vault above. Hearing transforms into feeling. The open vowels of Gregorian chant, O and A, dominate the chant repertoire. These are the vowels that most strongly activate the standing wave. The duration of individual notes, the pacing of silence between phrases. Deliberate. The silence is not empty. It is the interval during which the resonance builds. The chant and the architecture were not independent systems. They were engineered together, one as the instrument, one as the score. But here is where it stops being interesting and starts being difficult to set aside. Chartres Cathedral contains 167 stained glass windows covering 2,600 square meters of glass. The dominant color is cobalt blue, produced by cobalt oxide. Cobalt oxide filters specific frequencies of visible light while transmitting others. The wavelengths filtered by cobalt blue correspond to the frequencies that produce maximal arousal in the human visual cortex. By filtering them, the cathedral keeps the brain in a lower state of neurological activation. The acoustic field reduces verbal processing. The optical field reduces arousal. Both systems operate simultaneously on the body of the person standing inside. The Cathedral of Pisa contains a round-arched window on the south nave wall. Its position is precise. A single beam of sunlight strikes a specific shelf at noon on exactly March 25th. The Feast of the Annunciation. A marble egg sits on that shelf. The light falls on it once a year. This requires knowing the solar angles for that latitude. It requires calculation. It requires intention. Now look at this carefully, because this is the part most people walk past. The windows were not illustrating scripture. The light was being engineered. The Cathedral of Canterbury aligns its central axis to the precise horizon point where the sun rises on December 29th, the feast of Thomas Becket. This alignment is documented. The sun enters the nave on that specific date and moves along the central axis floor toward the altar. This is not symbolic placement. This is calculated geometry applied to the building's orientation. You can verify it yourself. Take any major Gothic cathedral, cross-reference its patron saint's feast day against the cathedral's orientation using satellite mapping tools and a liturgical calendar. The alignment holds across the major cathedrals of France, England, and Spain without exception. The navy proportions at Chartres, Amiens, and Notre-Dame de Paris all incorporate the golden ratio, the same mathematical relationship found in the proportional geometry of the human body. Not decoration, not symbolic ornament, engineered proportion, producing a predictable spatial experience. Medieval pilgrimage routes terminated at cathedrals. People traveled hundreds of miles specifically to be healed. The medieval church documented 2 categories of supplicants separately: those seeking cura corporis, physical cure of the body, and those seeking spiritual absolution. In surviving shrine records at Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, and Chartres, the people seeking physical cure outnumbered those seeking absolution. The limestone interior maintained a specific temperature and humidity profile independent of external weather. Limestone absorbs moisture. The atmospheric conditions inside a medieval cathedral are stable in a way no other medieval structure achieved. Consistent temperature, specific humidity, stable air. A body standing in that space for hours was inside a controlled environment. Here is the part which will change how you look at every cathedral you ever walk into. If the acoustics alone were coincidental, you could set them aside, but the acoustics and the optics point in the same direction. The light frequencies deliberately filtered, the standing waves deliberately engineered, and when the geometric proportion joins them, not as decoration, not as theological symbol, but as engineered proportion producing a predictable human state, as alignment producing a predictable moment of light, as resonance frequency producing a predictable neurological shift, the coincidence runs out of room. Three independent fields of evidence arriving at the same anomaly. The buildings were built to produce a specific effect in the body. The official explanation accounts for none of it. Now here is where the evidence stops being architectural and becomes personal. Abbot Suger designed Saint Denis in the 1140s. His design writings survive. His letters survive. He does not describe the light effects as beautiful or as illustrating scripture. He describes what they do to the person experiencing them. He was standing inside the nave of his own construction. The light came through colored glass he had specified, the mineral composition selected and sourced by him. The acoustic field around him was a function of stone vaulting he had designed at specific heights and curvature. He wrote, "I seem to find myself existing in some strange intermediate region of the universe. That is not an aesthetic observation. That is a description of a neurological state, the dissolution of the boundary between self and environment that the UCLA researchers would measure and name 9 centuries later." I have read that phrase in 3 separate translations. The language does not shift. He is not describing beauty. He is describing a state, a specific, measurable state, and he was conscious that he was in it. The master masons who built these structures operated through closed operative lodges. Their geometric ratios were transmitted orally through a system of physical gesture and spoken transmission. The proportions governing vault height relative to nave width were shown through the positioning of hands, through the alignment of tools. The lodge regulations from Strasbourg and Regensburg, both issued in 1459, codify the transmission hierarchy. The proportions are explicitly marked as restricted knowledge. The regulations specify who could know what, and in what order. What those regulations do not contain, the rationale for why those specific proportions were used. That knowledge was held inside the system, deliberately unwritten. The men who held it understood what they were building. They knew what it did. Systematic interior alteration begins in the 1530s and continues through the 1570s. Protestant Reformation theology driving it. The theological rationale was explicit. The sermon replaced the sacrament as the center of worship. Hearing the word required clarity, not reverberation. The reformers understood that the reverberation was a problem. They documented the problem. They fixed it. Church wardens' accounts document the pew installation with administrative precision. Masham's St. Mary, 1542. Bedale, St. Gregory, 1576. Ludlow Parish Church, pews installed before 1577. Line items, costs, carpenter names, wood type, number of pews, meticulous. Wooden pews covering the limestone floor changed the acoustic profile fundamentally. The resonating stone floor, which had contributed to the 110 Hz standing wave field, was covered. Wood absorbs sound where stone reflects it. The acoustic reverberation time in the same spaces after pew installation dropped significantly. In several documented cases, secondary vaulting or plaster rendering was applied to the original stone surfaces, further altering the acoustic reflection coefficient. The church was being unmade, piece by piece. Here is what should genuinely trouble you about these accounts. The accounts document costs to the penny: timber, plaster, glass, carpenter labor, the system being replaced, the acoustic profile, the light frequencies, the resonance conditions is never named as a system. It is never discussed. It was not considered worth documenting because the people writing the accounts did not know it was a system. They saw individual problems to be solved. They did not see the architecture as an integrated mechanism. The intact system was invisible to them. The stained glass the reformers installed where they removed old windows was clear. The specific light frequencies the cobalt oxide had been filtering, gone. The full spectrum of visible light entered. The effect of the filtered light was extinguished. If you've made it this far, You now know more than 99% of people. But the deeper pattern emerges when you look at what was documented and what was not. This pattern is not confined to England. In France, Germany, Spain, and the Low Countries, the same acoustic profile appears in the original structures. The same post-Reformation alterations where Protestant influence reached. The same absence of written design rationale across every surviving master mason record. Santiago de Compostela in Spain contains the Botafumeiro, the giant incense burner swung across the nave on feast days, producing a pendulum motion across the full width of the nave. The timing of its swing was not arbitrary. It was adjusted across centuries to match the nave's acoustic properties. The burner was tuned to the resonant frequency of the space itself. The incense burned in it was a documented specific mixture with identified psychoactive properties at sustained exposure. The feast day swinging of the Botafumeiro was not pageantry. It was the integrated system running. Independent researchers in acoustic archaeology, neuroarchitecture, and historical musicology have each arrived at the same anomaly. From 3 different disciplines, 3 different methods. They did not coordinate. They reached the same conclusion because the physical evidence led them there. The church warden's accounts that document pew installation are meticulous, comprehensive, cross-referenced, and dated. The Master Mason Lodge records that might document why the original acoustic conditions were engineered are oral, guild transmitted, and by the mid-16th century, dissolving. The 2 bodies of documentation do not overlap. One ended before the other was fully written. The suppression happened not through destruction, but through the dissolution of the system that held the knowledge. Stay with me here, because this next part matters. This is not an argument that a secret society built cathedrals as instruments of mass manipulation. What the evidence shows is narrower than that, and harder to dismiss. The buildings were precision-engineered environments, producing documented neurological effects. The Reformation systematically altered the physical conditions that created those effects. The record of the alteration is detailed. The record of the original design rationale does not exist. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was never written. It was transmitted through guild structures that dissolved in the same decades the alterations began. That coincidence has a shape. Suger stood in the nave of Saint-Denis in 1144. The light came through colored glass he had specified in colors derived from minerals he had sourced. The acoustic field around him was a function of stone vaulting he had designed at specific heights and curvature. He wrote the words that survived. I seem to find myself existing in some strange intermediate region of the universe. He knew what the space was doing. He was the last generation of commissioners who understood the design system well enough to specify it deliberately. Within a century of his death, the knowledge had become guild-held and unwritten. Within 4 centuries, the interiors had been systematically converted. What remains when you walk into a cathedral today? The stone proportions, the vault heights, the orientation. The bones of the machine are still there. What is missing? When you sit in a wooden pew, the seat and back absorb what the open floor would have returned. The standing wave at 110 Hz needs the hard stone floor to close the loop, to reflect upward and meet the downward wave from the vault. The pew breaks that loop. The frequency arrives at the vault. It does not complete the return. The body in the pew never receives it. The reverberation that would have built across 8 seconds in the empty stone space is absorbed within 2. The specific light frequencies the original glass transmitted are absent. The researchers who measure the resonant signature of these structures can still find the frequency encoded in the stone. The vaults still vibrate at 110 Hz. It just no longer reaches the people sitting inside. The pew accounts remain in the archives. The carpenter names are still legible. The costs are still there. Something precise was built here. We have the records of its dismantling. We do not have the records of why it was built.